Hello and welcome to the GCSE Biology tutorial for topic B6, Inheritance, Variation and Evolution. This tutorial will look at evolution, fossils, speciation, antibiotic resistance and classification. Starting off with, what is evolution? Well, this is based on the belief that all species have evolved from simple life forms from over 3 billion years ago. And Charles Darwin is someone you'll hear about a lot, and he was someone that truly believed in evolution and came up with the theory of natural selection. He travelled around the world on a boat called the HMS Beagle, and he made observations and collected fossils along the way. And he published a famous book later on in 1859 called On the Origin of Species. And he made the following conclusions. First of all, we know that organisms in a species have variations, so they're not all the same. And within a species, they will have to compete. And that's called survival of the fittest, because only those that are better adapted to certain places or certain conditions will have the beneficiary gene to be able to survive. So, for example, it could be those that had thicker fur, those that were faster, those that were different colours because of camouflage. Whatever it is, those organisms that have suitable characteristics were more likely to survive. They would have also therefore been more likely to reproduce and then pass on that gene for that characteristic that made them successful in the first place. And then the offspring that were then reproduced would have these genes, or be more likely to have these genes, and pass on to their future generations, and so on. And those that didn't and were not very well adapted, they wouldn't survive, and that feature wouldn't evolve. Now, at the time when Darwin proposed his idea of natural selection, it was controversial at the time, mainly because there was lack of evidence from other scientists. There was also a lack of understanding. Darwin wrote all this before people knew about why characteristics appear or how. They didn't know about mutations or genes. And also it went against religious beliefs that God created everything. Eventually the theory was accepted by many scientists as technology started to improve and DNA research, etc. And there is some examples we'll be looking at later on that help provide evidence towards evolution, such as the study of fossils and the study of antibiotic resistant bacteria. There were other people at the time that argued with Darwin about his ideas. One of the scientists was called Lamarck, and he said that actually organisms change over their lifetime and then pass this change on. So, for example, you've got a giraffe with a short neck, and over its life it stretches its neck to reach leaves, and then when it's stretched it enough, it's not going to get any longer, but it would pass this on to its young. Now, this theory was rejected after further studies, but at the time this was a belief that opposed Darwin's. But obviously we know this can't be true now because, say, for example, you had a dog and you dyed part of its hair pink, it wouldn't pass that on to its offspring. So you can only pass on something that is part of your genetic code. Extinction, that's when there's no more of a certain species left anymore. For example, the dodos, they were from the island of Mauritius, and when humans took over the island, they became extinct because of overhunting and destruction of their habitats. But extinction can happen for other reasons as well. It can happen due to environmental changes like the weather, changes in the amount of food available, predators, disease, competition, and natural disasters. A common belief that caused the dinosaurs to become extinct is an asteroid from space contributed to the change in the atmosphere. Speciation. Now, this was pioneered by another scientist called Wallace in the 1800s. Wallace was a supporter of Darwin and worked with him. He actually worked with him on a book where they both came up with natural selection as well. Speciation is the development of a new species. A species, let's just remind you what that is a group of similar organisms that can reproduce and produce fertile offspring. So basically, if they were to reproduce, what they produce could also reproduce. So they can only make offspring that are fertile. Speciation occurs when populations of the same species become so different they can no longer interbreed. Now, one example that can cause this is isolation, and that's due to like a physical barrier, might be due to islands being formed, where in an area the environment on one side is different to the other. So the two groups of organisms adapt and become different, and they become so different to each other they no longer are part of the same gene pool. Speciation happens a lot with birds because birds can obviously migrate or move and go to different areas when other animals might not be able to. An example is shown in this diagram here, where it just has a large population of people, and then they might be separated by a barrier, in this case some mountains, and then just through natural selection, just through mutations or genetics, some organisms are just different to others. And it might be that on one side of the barrier, those features are better, on the other side, different features are better. And over time, they pass on those desired features to their next generations to help them, because that's what helps them survive. And over time, you have organisms that are so different to each other, they're no longer part of the same species. Now, an example I mentioned before of evolution is antibiotic resistance in bacteria. Now, this is something we talked about before when we looked at mutations, and an example of this is MRSA. So what would happen is you have a group of bacteria which all reproduce normally, and some of them are just naturally resistant. So some of those bacteria do not get killed by an antibiotic. So when you come along and try and kill the bacteria with the antibiotic, most of them die, but some will remain. Those that remain can then multiply, and then they become more common. And eventually, the whole strain is resistant, and the whole group of bacteria is resistant. Now, MRSA was an infection that spread in hospitals very quickly because it became adapted and the bacteria could not be killed by that antibiotic. So new antibiotics have to be created all the time. This is a problem because it can cause infection to spread quickly and result in superbugs where there's bacteria that just can't be killed. And that's really important to make sure that you take antibiotics when needed, not be given them for everything. Sometimes your body can naturally kill bacteria, so it's not always beneficial to take antibiotics. And antibiotics don't cause resistance in bacteria, they just create a situation where naturally resistant bacteria have an advantage, and so that they can then multiply, which is what we don't want. It's also really important that you complete your full dose of antibiotics, because that means if there's any bacteria that's left in your body, they could be missed. You need to make sure you finish antibiotics so they're all killed. And finally, this example of evolution, or antibiotic resistance in bacteria, has caused an increase in demand for new drugs and antibiotics. For example, animals that can get ill as well need antibiotics, and they then can have bacteria that become resistant, and so disease can spread within the farming world. So there is an increase of demand for new drugs to be made all the time, which can be costly. Okay, moving on to classification. So classification is a way in which we group all the living things around the world. There's so many of them, we need to put them into a system. And this one was proposed by Carl Linnaeus in 1700. And he based it on the characteristics of different organisms and their structure. So every living thing belongs to one of 5 kingdoms, which then can then be subdivided into phylum, then a class, then an order, then a family, and then finally a genus and a species. Each organism in the world has been given a binomial name, and this is when everything's been given a 2-part Latin name, and that's based on its genus and its species. So humans, their Latin name is Homo sapien. Homo is the genus that humans belong to. Sapiens is a species, but you say it together, Homo sapiens. And this type of classification therefore means that it can be used universally. This language in other countries, they'll still understand the rules of classification. Now, as understanding has improved, the system has changed slightly. In 1990, Kawasi proposed that actually before you split them into these 7 groups, you would split them into 3 domains. And he did that by studying bacteria more and realising that not all bacteria belong in the same group. He realised actually there's 3 domains. There's archaea, which is primitive bacteria, bacteria, which is true bacteria, and then everything else belongs to the eukaryota. And then they can be subdivided into smaller groups, as mentioned before. Evolutionary trees. Now, these also show common ancestors and relationships between the species. And the more recent the common ancestor, the more closely related the 2 species are. So it doesn't mean that one organism came from another, but it means that they have common ancestors, if you look back on evolutionary trees. So sometimes people make the mistake of saying that humans come from monkeys or come from primates. And the important thing to remember is that's not what Darwin or what evolution proposes. Instead, it's that we have had common ancestors. Another thing that supports evolution is DNA analysis, which is obviously more recent, and fossil evidence. So for this part, I've come up with 2 key questions to cover this part of the topic. These would be worth about 3 marks each, so take your time to give as much information as you can and pause the tutorial for 10 minutes. Okay, so what was Darwin's theory of natural selection? Well, he basically said in a population there's going to be variation and there's going to be competition within that population to survive. Naturally, there will be organisms that have certain features that make them better adapted to survive, or survival of the fittest. This might be that they have thicker hair, or they're camouflaged, or they've got stronger teeth. It could be any feature. But those that have those features would be more likely to survive. And if they're more likely to survive, they'd be more likely to reproduce and pass on those features over many generations. And then that organism will start to evolve to have more organisms that have that feature. How are organisms classified? Well, you have the system that splits them into kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus and species. But then you also have the system that Kawasi came up with, which said that actually you could split them into 3 domains first. So you have the true bacteria, and you have archaea, and then you have everything else, such as plants, animals, fungi, and protists in eukaryota. You could also mention the binomial naming system, so talking about the fact that once an organism is classified, it can be named using its 2-part Latin name, which includes a genus and the species. If something has got the same genus, it's going to be more closely related. In summary, we've looked at evolution, fossils, speciation, antibiotic resistance and classification. Thank you.